Yeah, what I want or would like to talk about is, well, it's on the one hand a bit of a wrap up of what I've been working with sort of throughout the last about around 10 years, I would say. And at the same time, of course, it's also an attempt to look ahead and think about yeah, where to go from here. And that's what I think also, as said, these opportunities to discuss should be about, to not only sort of talk about that which we in a way already have found out about, but that which is still on the move and difficult to grasp. And yeah, I hope you can help me with some of the things that I'm myself still struggling with. So please, yeah, I hope you can be patient also and try to follow along. It's not always a very clear maybe stream of argumentation, but I'm trying to do my best to sort of also show, yeah, the openings of where this might be heading, and where I think also it needs further, yeah, both conceptual, but of course also empirical work. So the title I've given this talk now is Caringly Crafting Knowledge Together with Children on the Relevance of Digital Technology in Daycare Institutions. That's a relatively specific title. I will sort of take some detours on the way along that, but I mean, this is basically what I would claim it's also about. Let's put it like that. And well, as said, thanks a lot to Fernanda, Tony, and also Claudia, and congratulations on the 50-year LAEL graduate program, which means that actually it's around 2 years older than my university, or the university I'm at is, Roskilde University, just in case you have been wondering. So, but it's, yeah, it's in Denmark, by the way. And yeah, it's right outside more or less Copenhagen. It's the old capital actually of Denmark, Roskilde. But it's a relatively new university and a reform university. And yeah, we have a very special also pedagogical program where students actually write and research projects every semester. But I won't talk so much about that. What I want to talk about is, in a way, or what I would like to frame this talk with, is actually the question of, now I have gotten this wonderful invitation and I was wondering, applied linguistics, is that actually me? And what can I say about that? And then I thought, well, I'll take it as a point of departure to actually reflect a bit differently maybe on what I have been doing, because actually I am in social psychology of everyday life. But I think for me, actually, language or communication, I would say, is extremely central to my work. And I've been trying to sort of reflect a bit about why this is actually the case. And that's why I'm framing, or starting to frame this with sort of a biographical note, and maybe one could say an ontogenetic point of departure, because that which I am sort of very much interested in generally in my work is how people are able to communicate and then also collaborate, so act together, in spite of their ontogenetic uniqueness and their social material differences. So I have this focus always on in a way, what does it, how are we able to actually act together, even though in a way we are living so different lives and have and are also presumably experiencing life very differently. And I've been thinking a bit about sort of why I have been bothered yeah, by this question. And I think it has also to do, and that's really the very first time I'm trying to sort of relate this also to my biography. I don't know if that holds, but anyway, I grew up in Berlin, was born in Berlin into like a, yeah, one could say a mother-child diet, even though I had a brother, but I have a brother, but he's 16 years older. So he was kind of a different generation. So it was mostly my mother and me in the beginning, and she emigrated from Italy actually to Berlin. And we also have a lot of family which left, yeah, which stayed in Italy in a very, again, multilingual, multicultural environment, which is called South Tyrol, which is very northern top of Italy, which is actually a part of Italy where they have 3 administrative languages. It's Italian, it's German, and it's Ladinian, like an old Latin language. So these 3 languages are official languages in that part of Italy, and sort of this Italian-German mix especially sort of is something that has been sort of, well, been a part of my upbringing in a way all throughout my life. So there was always something about sort of being different places at the same time, being in different, well, in a way, cultures, especially different languages at the same time, has always sort of been something that also created, of course, a lot of struggles for me to some extent. Not to the extent that I really sort of suffered from it, but I think it was always in the background. How do I make myself understandable in different contexts, and what does it take also to, in a way, become understandable in different contexts? And I don't know if it's so important to have this as a biographical note, but as said, for me, it's something that in a way is important to, in a way, reflect on, because as a researcher, it's impossible to not also have a be in a trajectory that in a way also shapes what it is we become interested in. And I think it's important to somehow also have that reflection with us in order to be able to also explain to other people, also those people we collaborate with in our research, how it is that we became interested in that which we are investigating. And I'm trying to make sort of more points about that later. But I think in a way, what is really important here is that it's not only about me. I mean, this may seem like an awful egocentric start in times of sort of especially widespread global suffering. But I think this is more an understanding of sort of there's a general struggle of trying to, of course, understand one another, but not only understand in order to be able to act together and act with one another. And for me, that is sort of a general project. And in that sense, I would say I'm also subscribing to a notion of general psychology, where it is really sort of in order to find sort of possibilities to also conceptualize what it is we are doing and how we're understanding that can help us in a way transcend the uniquenesses and differences that we experience all the time in everyday life, which I don't want to do away with, not at all. But still, what I find so fascinating is that even though we're experiencing life so differently, and especially also, for instance, how we're experiencing emotions, for instance, now I have pain and suffering, but also joy and happiness, also the productive sides in a way of experiencing. How is it that we can sort of bring that together, even though each of us perhaps actually experiences that slightly differently? So this is just kind of to frame what I think, or why I think that in a way I also have to say something that has to do at least with, let's say, languaging, communicating. And I think I'm going to take this trajectory in a way, this understanding of that which I want to work with and work on is trying to, in a way, conceptualize in ways that make it possible to transcend, in a way, divisions. So let's see where that takes me. When I, in a way, started then looking around, or actually studying psychology then, and I will return also to another small biographical note in a second, but that which I became most interested in then, and that is, I think, important for me, is that the theory that I'm proposing now today, which is what I have termed here social material critical psychology, which on the one hand has this, extra aspect of, it's called a psychology from the standpoint of the subject, which means that in a way we always have to ask the subjects what it is that they actually, how they understand the world and how they experience world. It's important that as a psychologist, as a critical psychologist, not only we adopt our concepts and think that they are helpful to the other. We need to understand the other and see whether the concepts that we're working with actually are also relevant to them. So that is what's behind that understanding of a psychology from the standpoint of the subject. And it's from within praxis for the conduct of everyday life. And that means, again, sort of the concepts that we're working with, they should be relevant for acting together, for the conduct of everyday life, or for other people also to be able to conduct their everyday life, one could say, in more meaningful ways. This theoretical point of departure is not only, or does not only propose concepts that are relevant perhaps or hopefully to others, but why I find it important is because it helps understand also, me, myself, and my own way of living everyday life. So the theoretical framework is not only something abstract for me, it's something that I think I'm sort of living through and understanding my own living through. And that is what makes it possible to, in a way, relate my own conduct of everyday life to other people's conduct of everyday life through this conceptual framework. So that is what I think a conceptual framework should be able to do, at least when we're talking psychology, when we're talking subjectivity, when we're thinking of sort of what is it that brings us together, right, and makes it possible for us to act. Some of the, well, one could say other terms that, for instance, this critical psychology is operating with is, of course, agency, but very much understood as a participation in the co-creation of social material conditions. So it's participation, it's not only agency that rests with the only one individual, but it's always sort of directed towards a participation in a co-creation of conditions. Development, for instance, also as a very central concept, means then also developing new forms of taking part in this co-creation. And one concept that I find very important is mutual learning. So learning is also learning to collaborate on developing knowledge and agency together. And that's where, as also Fernanda introduced me, for me, it's very important to think that also across different kinds of thresholds. And I've especially worked sort of with age thresholds, so different generations, so to speak, and how we're able to communicate and learn together with children. So what I want to propose in a way, and what the whole talk will be basically revolving around, is that this theoretical framework is basically suggesting or proposing a deeply caring and democratic psychological approach, whose ethos is expressed in its methodology, which is entitled co-research. And I mean, there's also other, of course, traditions that work with notions of co-research, but I think what's really sort of resting here in this theoretical framework is that it's really about co-research, not only something that we do because, well, we are researchers and that is what we are sort of offering to our participants. No, it's actually the only way for us to create meaningful knowledge about subjectivity is to engage in co-research with others who also regard us as their co-researchers. So this is to say that the theoretical framework for me is something that needs to be in a way embodied and makes sense also to the researcher him herself, just as much as it potentially also at least makes sense to those that we are collaborating together with. Why did I find this so attractive? I'm trying to sort of now quickly grasp. I started in a way with my studies of psychology because actually I did, well, something that was for me in a way unexpected. Before studying in Germany at that time, at least, you either were drafted into the military or you could do a social service. I decided to do social service, and the best place I could find was the hospital that was right across from where I was living. And basically I just chose that because it was in a way convenient, I guess. But actually that changed entirely what I thought about what it is that I want to do with my, well, future, or at least what I get interested in. Before that, I was somebody who thought he would become a number cruncher, actually, to be honest. But I went into sort of this social service, the social duty service, where I was working in a hospital for almost a year. And what I became most interested in was actually, it was the first time I met people that were very different from what I understood myself to be, and I, in a way, understood very quickly that, for instance, they were using and consuming very different media than I was. Something that I really, I mean, they had sometimes a completely different understanding worldview from, of what was happening basically in the same city, in the same country, in the same world in a way. But at the same time, they were still able to communicate with me, and we were able to, in a way, also talk about how they were doing in everyday life. So just saying that in a way, that was something that, again, came very early sort of into my understanding of what it is that I want to work with, is to basically see that, on the one hand, acknowledge that people can have very different understandings and views of what's happening, but at the same time, hey, well, in that context, maybe we needed to collaborate because they were patients and I was supposed to also to help them. But I became interested in their everyday life, and I became interested in why it is that, in a way, we have so different views of what's happening in the world, and nevertheless sort of are able to, in a way, also care about and for one another. And that was really something that I found to be very, well, as said, interesting, something that really sort of made me change, in a way, my entire attitude to what it is that I want to do. First I thought, well, I want to do something social. Then I thought, well, psychology would be interesting because of somehow trying to understand how it is that people, in a way, shape their perception. But what I was sort of recommended to do was to have a certain focus, especially on media psychology and media pedagogy. So the technology part also quickly came in, and also an understanding of media is something very relevant to look into in order to understand differences, in a way, of how we come to gain knowledge about the world and one another, but at the same time also something that brings us together, because I mean, we still share a lot of media narratives together, and yeah, on the one hand they are sort of unifying, and on the other hand they are also very much dividing, maybe camps nowadays, maybe even more than they have been around 20 years ago when I did this or looked into this. Anyway, again, sort of a framing of trying to say sort of why it is that I find it so important to look across divides into sort of that which is unifying and in a way brings us together and able to act together. It also, in a way, leads me to say that communication, the way that I understand communication, is always already communal action. Oh, is it communal? Well, I don't know, but at least it is some form of action. And also all action is communicative. So in that sense, when I actually talk about communication, this caring communication that I want to propose throughout the talk, I always mean, in a way, already action. What I find to be important here, though, and that is something that I can sort of then try to conceptualize a bit further, is the whole question of, okay, yes, it is, all action is communicative, but is it so clear what it is that is being communicated? And how can we actually come to investigate that which is vague and indeterminate, not only in the communication with others, but also in the communication with ourselves? That is actually what I find especially interesting when we are also starting to, in a way, try to think, well, it is not only a project of understanding the other, it's just as much a project of understanding oneself when engaging in communication. Okay. So where are we today? Because now I'm trying to sort of leave this more, well, both biographical, ontogenetic sort of course behind, trail behind, and think more about sort of what it is that I have become then caught up with nowadays. And I just quickly have to check the time that I'm not talking too long. Yes. I would say that nowadays we're facing sort of an interesting time where communication has basically also changed very, well, I wouldn't say radically, but where more the question of why it is that we're communicating has maybe become more central than ever. That's maybe what I would claim, that in a way communication is ubiquitous, and it's visibly ubiquitous. As said, I would say communication was ubiquitous all the time before as well, but now we have sort of communication technologies that are themselves ubiquitous and that make it very clear that we're in a way engaging in communication even when we're not talking to one another, right? So people with smartphones are of course the most notable experience nowadays, but what I find to be interesting is sort of that this kind of communication also, the indeterminacy of communication becomes in a way more visible and evident, because a lot of the communication that is happening does not only affect sort of our communication to others, it's also communication into some form of a system. And the reasons for why we are communicating and why we are communicating, for instance, by sort of sharing data with a lot of big corporations, but potentially also the state and so forth. The question of why we're doing this very seldom is actually really posed, especially in sort of everyday life context. We just, in a way, do that and engage in that because that has become, in a way, the new normality. And the aspect that we're basically also communicating into a system, into a void where sort of it's very unclear what we are communicating into, something that I think is very interesting to, in a way, take a hold of nowadays, because in a way it's an indeterminacy that and some kind of a vagueness that is being sort of also systematized and built into the technologies that we're using. So the question of why we're using the technologies that we're using and what is the potential, for instance, for collaborating with one another is not so much discussed. And I think that is something that is very clear also when looking into how, well, technologies, digital technologies are being used in daycares nowadays. So that's why I'm actually looking or talking in a way about yeah, nowadays technology in a broader sense, communication technologies, because in a way a trend that is being seen in that regard, I think, can also be found very much in educational technologies, and especially in the daycare that I will be talking about now. So the last question that I have now on the bottom of this slide, how to attain meaningful knowledge about digital analog, and I'm also always thinking that together, the digital and the analog always goes together, but that which is relevant. Why is it relevant to communicate? That is basically what I find the most important question to be that I'm at the moment caught up with. And when I talk about relevance, and I'm just gonna sort of quickly introduce sort of what I understand by that, I, at least some years ago, have written about sort of emancipatory and technical relevance, which goes back to the concepts of Habermas, but which also 𝗁𝗲𝗵𝗃, who is basically the founder of well, German critical psychology from a standpoint of the subject, he has been also very much influenced by Habermas and sort of this differentiation between emancipatory and technical relevance. And I think, well, emancipatory relevance is something that I think is, well, you may all be in a way also accustomed to talking about. Technical relevance is often understood as that which is sort of, well, in a way, the negative way of understanding relevance, that we're only sort of, well, in a way, making, for instance, concepts for others so that others can be used according to our wishes. So an instrumental understanding in a way of relevance. And that is also very clear that this is not what critical psychology wants, right? I mean, they want to establish and create theories and methods not about affected people, as 𝗁𝗲𝗵𝗃 is saying, but instead for the affected people. So it's really sort of the emancipatory ideal ingrained into this is very clear. However, it's not only maybe about emancipatory relevance, but it's just as much making sure that the emancipatory relevance is not something that, in a way, well, disappears again, right? We want also it to be somehow sustainable, sustainable intervention that we're doing, trying to help others by creating concepts through which we can understand one another better. And in a way, we would also like this to, well, be of relevance also to the people we're doing research together with, also for the future. So from my understanding, actually, emancipatory relevance needs to be thought together with some form of a technical relevance, so as to technically make as sure as possible that the concepts, in a way, are helpful also to the people that we want to collaborate with. And how can we do that? That is kind of what I think is really difficult also to work with and speak about. But that is when I'm talking about relevance that I would like to, in a way, try to think the two together. So to think emancipation as something not only to do for the other, but also for myself together with the other, in ways that we can sustainably also continue thinking ourselves through these concepts and thereby establish also a form of technical relevance. And one could, for instance, use or point to Morten Nissen's work also, who actually also talks about that we have to make sure that the freedom of critical thinking, the academic thinking, in a way, become part of the real world of necessity, right? So as to attain a practical relevance. And that could maybe be thought as kind of combining emancipatory and technical relevance. But I will try to return to that when talking a bit more about also transformative activist work. Let's see how far I can get with that. Otherwise, we can discuss that for sure. So what I want to return to again is sort of this notion or this question that I had before, how to sort of think about technology in everyday life in a way that we can think about the relevance of technology. And relevance, as said, both emancipatory and technical. So let's look into sort of the empirical material that I have been working with. Now, especially the last few years as part of the Danish Center for Research in Early Childhood Education and Care, where I've been working with different daycare institutions in qualitative ways. One could call it participant observations. I would just call it participations. So I've been sort of participating in the everyday life of daycare staff and children and parents throughout the course of several months or even years. Of course, not all the time, and more sort of intermittently, so to speak. But in a way also to follow, in a way, the development also, especially of the digitalization of some of these daycare institutions. And it's by far not all daycare institutions that are equally digitalized in Denmark, one must say. There's some that are much more digitalized than others. Usually it's municipalities that decide to implement it differently. But sometimes it's also the single daycare centers that some of them say that we want to digitalize more, and others that actually are still holding back quite a bit. So I've been trying to work with both daycare centers that are a bit more digitalized and some that actually have rejected it as much as possible, so to put it like that. But this is now an example of one of the daycare centers that has been sort of a bit more digitalized, and what can be found very often is, in a way, and I will just sort of quickly show this slide. There's three sort of reasons for, or that are named at least, for introducing digital technology in daycare institutions. One of them, which we probably all know about, is the promotion of children's digital learning, or rather instruction, but I will say about that something about that in a sec. But also especially communication with parents. That is also a very important aspect, that in a way daycare staff can communicate to the parents what has been happening throughout the day. So to keep them updated, basically, especially about sort of what's been happening in the children's groups. And the last one is monitoring, and that is of course one of the most ubiquitous ones, and one that has been introduced the earliest. Monitoring and convergence of administratively relevant data. So for instance, attendance. And that is on the left side, you can see a picture of one of these check-in iPads, where you have to check in your child when coming into the daycare, and then also have to check your child out again when leaving daycare. And that is used, for instance, in order to then also make sure that enough meal is provided, and also to have like stats of attendance over a longer period of time, so as to sort of predict how much, for instance, food, but also other kinds of utilities you need also for the coming month and so forth, right? So it's really sort of a way of administrating also the daycare. And that is very ubiquitous, and that is used a lot. But usually when we talk about, in a way, digitalizing daycare, what we usually mean is the educational aspect, right, or the pedagogical aspect. And here I think this critique of Marianne Hillegaard is actually very interesting and important to take into consideration, that in a way, usually it's not so much about the promotion of children's digital learning, but perhaps it's rather sort of the promotion of digital instruction, so to speak. So very formalized understanding of what this kind of material is supposed to achieve, instead of, and that is what Marianne Hillegaard would propose, that it should, she thinks that this technology, that training materials should motivate children to enter new social situations and give them conceptual tools to explore these. And I think that's not happening so very much. Usually it's more instruction that's happening when thinking about sort of digitalizing daycare and daycare education. Again, sort of back to the question of relevance. So why do we then need, or do we need actually this kind of digitalization of daycare? And I think that in a way, well, there's certainly some good reasons that one could think about. And maybe one of the reasons would be the last one that Marianne Hillegaard is pointing out. One could maybe use technologies to enter into new social situations and give conceptual tools to explore these. Perhaps that could be a way forward. But I think from what I have observed, this is not happening that much. I have an example of that also happening. But in a way, what is more maybe seems to be the relevance, and that is why I have chosen the title of the slide, that there's an adult illusion of knowing even better via digitalization of daycare and this form of data valence or surveillance through aggregating and harvesting data about children. So there's an understanding of well, we need to be in control as basically the daycare administrators, but of course also as those that are sitting in the municipality and so forth. They want to be in control and be able to predict sort of how, in a way, well, children's learning on the one hand develops, where they develop to. There's this understanding of school readiness, for instance, that one wants to, that people want to, in a way, be able to well, control and predict. But there's also, of course, the notion of just being able to have sort of a meaningful communication with the parents in ways that the parents, in a way, also support the programs of the daycare center, but also of the municipality in terms of their learning goals, right? So all of this, in a way, seems to be lying behind an understanding of, hey, we need to digitalize in order to be able to better, yeah, control and predict what's happening in the daycare, especially in terms of learning, to some extent, maybe also in terms of well-being, but some understanding of, well, I would say a top-down instructional and instrumental model of what is important to take into consideration in everyday life at the daycare. That is sort of one problem, I would say. One problem is really that there is sort of this understanding that, and which is promoted, that adults through digital means know better and better how to, in a way, move the children towards specific outcomes, learning outcomes, but also other kinds of outcomes. That is one problem, I would say, that there's this illusion that is created. What is sort of the backdrop of this, and this is sort of another example from the digital realm, is that in a way what's being lost out of sight is, well, one could say the actual everyday life happening at the daycare, even in terms of what's happening in a way in the digital realms of children, and of what they find to be interesting around digital technology. So I have this one example that I also wrote about in my PhD project, so around 2013, 14, of a boy who was very much caught up with this character called Sonic the Hedgehog, and maybe some of you know them. I mean, he's been around since the 90s, very central character in many computer games, but also in TV series and merchandise and everything else. The thing is that, interestingly, this boy was at home very much caught up with computer games, but at the daycare where he was, and there was actually well, that's an example from Germany, but I've seen similar examples also in Denmark. There's certain aspects of the everyday life that cannot be picked up by the pedagogical staff, because that is not in their interest of understanding sort of digital characters and narratives, and also the technology surrounding these. In a way, there's an attempt to also hold the digital out of daycare institutions. That's kind of the well, one could say, anti-discourse to the one before, where there's sort of this understanding of, hey, digital technology can help us with better controlling what's happening at the daycare. There's also quite a lot of practitioners, especially that I have met, but also actually daycare leaders, who in a way rather would like the digital to keep it completely out of the daycare. The problem is that if you have sort of this radical anti-stance, in a way, that these problems that the boy has been facing, and the problem that he has been facing, was that he was very much caught up with this character, but no other child actually knew about it. And every time he tried to sort of introduce it into play situations and so forth, he was actually basically laughed at. Nobody understood why and how he was engaging sort of in play situations. And the pedagogues were not able to, in a way, help him, because they didn't know what this was about. In a way, yeah, there was a big sort of misunderstanding of what this boy's interests actually are, what his needs are, and how they could be integrated, in a way, into a meaningful play, or I would say collaboration with the other children. because there was this understanding that this boy was just too much caught up with his own digital world, and we cannot really access that and relate to it. So actually, I, as a researcher, then was able to, in a way, be a bit a mediator in this, but not in a technical way, or not in a way that actually was sustainable, I would say. I just could show that, of course, there's some sense making and meaning making behind this, and his attempts to also introduce himself as a valuable collaborator into the daycare. But yeah, the pedagogues, or I was maybe just collaborating too little in a way, or not long enough in order to make sure that, in a way, sustainable collaboration could take place in the longer run. And that's something that I'm still, in a way, very much thinking and reflecting about in critical ways. So anyway, so neither sort of the very techno-invitational and enthusiastic discourse, I think, makes a lot of sense. Neither does sort of the very techno-skeptic discourse make a lot of sense when talking about this, the digitalization of daycare. For me, it's really a question of, okay, we need to return to always the question of, why do we need this? For what purposes? What is it also that we want, in a way, in a pedagogical setting like a daycare? What is it that we want to attain as a, well, one could say, as a community, as an institution, institutionalized community? What kind of pedagogy is it that we want to have here? But very much it's a bigger question of what kind of a, well, I would say, democratic ideal and citizen ideal do we want to build in this kind of an institutional setting together with the children? Not only something that we teach the children, but something that we learn and do together. And what role can technology actually play in this, I would say. So now I can see that I've been talking already quite a bit, and I need to pay attention not to go extremely over time. I still have a lot of slides to go, and I think I should maybe hop some over. So sorry about that, but I think I just need to make sure to come to the most important points for me. I think what for me is really important is that we can, in a way, only ask this question of relevance, both as researchers, but as any other adult, in a way, working and being together with children. We can only ask the question and give meaningful answers to the question of relevance if we actually collaborate with children on trying to find out what the relevance of this institutionalized, well, everyday life could be at the daycare center, but also in the family, also in the public space, and so forth, in every context, in a way where children are also present. And this presupposes, though, that children are not, well, exceptionalized, that they are not rendered something other that, in a way, needs a very specific kind of, well, maybe attention. Yes, everybody needs specific attention, I would say, but where we need a conceptualization that makes it possible for us to think sort of adults and children as being able to collaborate together and understand one another in order to actually build a better world together, so to speak. And a lot of the conceptualizations in play at daycare centers, but yeah, also in many other settings, I would say, of the child, ontologies of the child, actually have this kind of a defectological view ingrained that Vygotsky has been talking about. I mean, he has been talking about children that, in a way, are often termed disabled, right? But I mean, for me, this ability view of children, or defectological view of children, not only affects those that we call sort of abnormal children. In a way, we abnormalize all children by, in a way, not thinking so much about what it is we have in common as adults and children that makes it possible for us to communicate across sort of these generational divides and thresholds. And age differences and developmental differences and everything else. I mean, there's a lot of differences, of course, but that is the case with every other human being. So we are nevertheless somehow able to communicate with children. How can we do that in caring ways? That's basically what I think is important to pose as a question here. I come with this example, which Fernanda has seen before, just as a possibility to sort of think about what can research do in this context. I think that it's very much about sort of an ethical stance, one could call it, of what research, this kind of research with children, but actually with every other human being, is in a way to depart from, I would say. And it's exactly not about thinking that we as researchers or we as adults, whoever is doing sort of this kind of research, but also whoever is doing pedagogical projects, interventions, and so forth, that we know better. Of course, we know something, and it's not about hiding that we know something, but we know very little about the other. We always do, because in a way the other is, we cannot be the other. We cannot stand in the shoes of the other. That's not possible, but we're able to communicate with the other. But in order to be able to communicate in caring ways, I would say, we need to be open to a co-exploration and humility in a way of being very aware that we know very little, and especially we don't really know anything about the other until we've been communicating and collaborating together. And this example that I have here is just sort of an example of me having been, well, in a way troubled by a child, and that was only possible, I would say, because I was in a very exploratory mode of doing research. I was actually running around with my digital camera, trying to sort of take a lot of pictures of everything that was going on in daycare. And I asked this boy who was playing with those things called ++s, whether I could take a photo of him. And he said, no, wait a second. And then he started sort of building something with these ++s. And that is what you can see on the left side. That's basically, well, he called it his camera, right? So he basically built himself a camera. And then he said, okay, now that I have a camera, you can take a photo of me if I can take a photo of you. So that's the photo that I took, where he is basically having, yeah, also taking a picture with his fingers. And so we are basically, well, in a way, mirroring one another in that situation. But we are not only mirroring one another, actually we are having a very, well, specific kind of communication collaboration through that object, mine being a camera, his being sort of also a camera, but the technology makes it possible also for us to, in a way, explore one another and what it, for instance, means to be a researcher, but also what it means to be a fellow human being in that setting, right? So for me, that is one of those moments where actually I, like the hybrid of me with my camera, the researcher hybrid, so to speak, with his technology, I very much became aware that, of course, I mean, that's not something to hide. That is a possibility for us to collaborate and communicate around the technology that we're using in our everyday life as a researcher, researching adult, as a child with sort of his toys. But the toys, it's not just a toy. It's actually a way of an invitation in a way to co-explore together, I would say. So it's important to, in a way, embrace not knowing in order to be able to learn mutually from one another and co-explore world together. And I think that is what technology, in a way, is supposed to be doing, if we follow at least also what Marianne Hillegaard wrote about any kind of sort of, yeah, educational material, I would say. And that is how we can, in a way, also transcend difference as apartheid. It's about sort of, yeah, using technology not to think to know better about the other, but in order to explore where the other is, who the other is, and how we can sort of make the best out of our ways of being together and becoming together, so to speak. And I have, yeah, called that every now and then a teleogenetic collaboration, even though that word is a bit of a tongue breaker, but it's about sort of finding out where are we heading also together in, yeah, this practice called a daycare institution where we have been meeting. But not only that, it's also about, well, basically society that we are sharing with one another. Where do we want to take that? I mean, it's very grand questions, but it's questions that we're all the time, well, co-negotiating in a way with everybody around us and also with children. Where is it that we're heading together? So this is basically maybe the last thing that I really want to point out, that there's so much more slides to show and so much more to say, but I think what is important in a way, and I will just quickly go through to the one of the last slides here. Sorry. But it's also about, and I just want to quickly go into the question of care, because I think it's really about also not only developing an ethical stance for research, it's about developing an ethical stance that is democratic, an ethical stance that makes it possible for us to not only take democracy actually for granted just as much as we shouldn't take technologies that we are applying in a daycare, for instance, as just given. It's something that makes it possible for, in a way, us to develop in democratic ways possibilities to collaborate and be with one another. And that requires care, that we care for one another, about one another, that we actually care with one another about world also. And that entails that we also overcome many of the divides that we also take for granted, especially now I've been talking about the adult-child divide, but one also needs to talk about the researcher-research divide. And I would say also, but that is another topic, the human-non-human divide, but that's really for another talk. But I think really it's important to think care into research and into applying, developing technology, digital technology in every kind of setting, but also just as much in daycare settings. And that is basically what I wanted to mostly talk about today.